Tristan Scott is an electrical engineer who took an interest in optimal health while recovering from Post Concussive Syndrome. He joins me to discuss two of his favorite subjects and the book he wrote about them, Bitcoin and beef, on this week's episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. Thank you for joining me today for another episode of Hunger Hunt Feast. With me is Tristan Scott. Tristan, welcome.
How's it going, Zane?
Good.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Tristan's an electrical engineer with a passion for health and actually Bitcoin for decentralized finance. And we met at Paul Saladino's first gathering in Costa Rica in 2021 and stayed connected. And Tristan has recently written a book called Bitcoin and Beef. For those of you who can see it in the video, that's what it looks like, Bitcoin and Beef. And I wanted to have him on to discuss those topics, which are both common. I mean, definitely at Paul Saladino's, we talked about a lot of beef, but also there's just a lot in that space that are really, looking at Bitcoin as a way for like more personal freedom. And so this is a really cool combo. I have not seen them together in a book until now. So I'm glad you joined me on here. I appreciate it to talk about your book. Let's back up a little bit for you. What give me a little bit of information about your journey. Like, how did you come to follow an animal-based diet? How did you get to that point in your health journey where that seemed like the best choice for you?
Yeah, definitely. I think setting the scene is a good idea. So for me, I was always, somewhat healthy, played a lot of sports growing up. My mom cooked a lot of home cooked meals, probably less processed foods than most Americans. So I'm fortunate for that. But I would say really took a transition. So I played soccer in college, and in my last year of school, I just sustained one too many concussions, and really my health kind of deteriorated from there. I had post concussive syndrome for, over a year, daily headaches, couldn't work out. Doctors were telling me to just take it easy, slowly return to the things I was doing, and nothing was really helping. So I kind of just got into searching for, remedies on my own. So that's kind of how I discovered the health community. Started listening to podcasts. Ben Greenfield was like the first one, and then kind of just being exposed to the greater health community from there, which I hadn't realized was such a vast amount of information from all the books, podcasts, YouTube videos, you name it. And a lot of people had similar stories. So that was kind of how I got into the health side of things. And from there, fine tuning my lifestyle, focusing on sleep, stress, slowly getting back into exercising, changing my diet, cutting out the processed foods, experimenting with a low carb diet for a while, helped me a ton for my concussion and brain health. And then, since then, that was about, 3 years ago. And since then, I've just been fine tuning from there, and, recently been more into the animal-based diet. It works for me. I think ancestrally it's more consistent from like a Central Northern European descent. So that's definitely what I follow more so, especially in the winter times where, produce wouldn't be so readily available for us, especially when I'm mostly living up here in Wyoming and Utah, compared to Paul, who's in Costa Rica with plentiful fruits, right? So either way, that's kind of the story of how I got into health. Just been obsessed with it since then, and it's really changed my life. I feel like way better than I did before my concussions, which is crazy to think because I literally couldn't walk across campus without being so fatigued and barely able to finish my school, which was a really stressful period. But I never would have discovered how to optimize your health if it weren't for that life situation.
Wow. So really you got to a point where you had to figure something out. You had to find a way to make improvement. And that seems to be the common thread with so many people who have gotten, they're looking for some big answers because, doing what everyone else is doing isn't working anymore. There's not a really big, they're not experiencing change. That's great. That's quite a, yeah, I know soccer is big for concussions. That's, I mean, people talk about football and it's a big issue in football, but soccer is right up there with them, and you might want to help.
Yeah,
So,
I was a center defender, so it was mostly heading, going up for a lot of head balls and
yeah,
slide tackles. So some
yeah,
positions more than others, but
for sure,
definitely.
for sure, absolutely. So, and the other, I don't know if this is a good time to transition that, but I mean, the other passion here on the book is beyond the diet is Bitcoin. And so, what is, I mean, you're an electrical engineer, so I can kind of see the tie-in there. We're just understanding, um, kind of you're going to have a better understanding of the technology there than most. Um, and so you're going to be less fearful or confused of information when you're starting to look into it. So that might, make you, I think, more receptive or less intimidated by it than your average person who thinks, "Oh my gosh, this is weird. What do you mean it's a code, or it's a you got to mine it?" So that kind of terminology has thrown a lot of people off for about 8 or 9 years now. And so what got you looking closer at Bitcoin?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I mean, overall, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, I kind of started out getting more into it, just being a university student at a tech school, engineer. So in 2017, a lot of people were talking about this. Of course, is getting very popular. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then the market bubble at the end of 2017, early 2018. It was just a crazy exposure, and you realize kind of, wow, this could be like the new frontier of money, of technology, similar to the adoption of the internet in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was very intriguing from a technical technology perspective, and what you're saying, yeah, as an engineer, you definitely can conceptualize and grasp the concept of why blockchain is such a differentiated technology. So yeah, that kind of got me interested, absolutely. And then that was, like I said, 2017, 2018, had that early exposure, and then fully, rode out the bear market, had my learnings with altcoins, or, not the best yeah, coins to be invested in. And you kind of go back, you relearn why the fundamentals of Bitcoin is different from every other cryptocurrency that exists. And yeah, it all comes down to decentralization, and where the paths converged, from like my recovery from health, and then for Bitcoin, and continuing that passion is taking ownership, taking control of your life. Your
Mm.
your health and your finances are two of the most important aspects of your life, right? If you want to be happy, you want to have your health, and you need some wealth, of course, as well. So having a deeper understanding of those two aspects, and then also being able to have control and more freedom over them compared to the traditional systems, that's where I started to, I naturally gravitated towards both these things. But then it clicked in my head how it was for this, the same exact reason, really. And that's kind of, after talking to more and more folks, like you and others at the animal-based retreats on Instagram, and I'm seeing a lot of Bitcoiners or carnivores, and seeing a lot of animal-based people, or just people in health are into Bitcoin. I'm like, wow, there's a total overlap here. So why
Mm.
don't I try and write a book about this as kind of like an introduction for people who may not already have taken the deep dive, or maybe are on one side, are into Bitcoin and crypto, and are not into health, or should be more into health. And they also have a lot of similar criticisms from like the mainstream media. So that's how this kind of all converged. And I really
Gotcha.
think it all stems back to taking control of your life, and an increased position of freedom, uh, from the wrongings of, the traditional systems, food, health, and finance, that has kind of diminished our value as at the individual level.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I can see it. I can see it. And yeah, it's absolutely the second most popular topic other than food seemed to be about Bitcoin or altcoins or some sort of decentralized currency. So let's get into that a little bit, since you said an introduction to someone might be on one side or the other, but not sure where to start. Let's bare bones. Let's talk about, what is Bitcoin? Why is it important? Why is it better than a global reserve currency, your typical dollar, euro, peseta, whatever you want to, peso. Why is this important, and why should everyone be paying attention to this technology?
Yeah, definitely. That's, it's chapter 1 in the book, what is Bitcoin? Because I feel like even people who know what it is, I mean, most people have heard of it at this point, right? But still, most people don't really understand the fundamentals of the network of Bitcoin, why it was created, what are the real advantages. They think it's just a quick way to make a good investment. But in reality, if you grasp the fundamentals, then you'll be, a long-term holder for life, probably, because it's that astounding. So first off, it comes down to programmed digital scarcity. So the value of, a certain item comes down to the supply of it. You always hear demand and supply and demand when it comes to economics. So if there's less of something, if the beef supply in the US just got cut in half, it would probably be worth more to the individual, or worth more to the market, because there's the same amount of demand but half the supply. So in our current financial monetary system, which really is at a crux right now, and you're seeing this almost double-digit levels of inflation because of the excess monetary printing that was added during or after the COVID crash in March of 2020. All the stimulus checks, all the relief packages, the trillions of dollars that was added in circulation. So what that does is devalues the average purchasing power of the dollar and whatever other currency, the euro. They were all printing money as well, because there's far more in circulation. I think this statistic often gets misconstrued or miscommunicated, but it's somewhere around, the total amount of dollars, or the M2, M3 money supply has increased by like 40-50% since 2020. So some astounding amount, like 40% of the US dollars in circulation has been created since the start of 2020, which it is incomprehensible, right? So you can understand why everything costs more. But from a Bitcoin perspective, well, first off, it's not, the core code is not changeable. So the founders are 100% anonymous to this day. Went by the name Satoshi Nakamoto. And he created the core code that limited the supply to never exceed 21 million Bitcoin. So there can never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. And he programmed it to be released in a fashion that would diminish over time how much was added. Each year or each 4 years, there's an event that occurs that's called the halving, that kind of reduces the amount added to circulation on a daily or 10-minute increment basis, technically, by the mining network, which we can get more into, by 50%. So I believe over 19 million Bitcoin have been mined or released into circulation already, but we won't hit that 21 million target until another 75 years or so, I believe.
Yeah.
But 19 million Bitcoin, 21 million Bitcoin, you can imagine this is a fixed number. Nobody can change it. So at first, there's more and more being released into circulation. There is, less demand. It's not really a household common name until maybe 2017, or even maybe not until 2020, 2021. So the value and demand was not as high, but now you can see that's what's driven the price to some degree over, it's reached as high as $69,000 per one coin.
Yeah.
So that's one benefit is the digital program scarcity, and that number can't be fixed. They can't print more Bitcoin or mine more Bitcoin. That 21 million number is set, and it can't be changed.
Right.
So that's one aspect, and then also it's been compared to gold a lot because gold has been a very historic, sound money. Or an inflation hedge, because it also has kind of a fixed supply as a precious metal. It doesn't necessarily have a 100% fixed supply, but due to the effort and investment needed to extract gold, there has always been kind of a certain rate of which the supply increases that's been pretty fixed. I believe it's maybe 4 or 5% annually. So it's pretty compared to a fiat currency like the US dollar. It's pretty fixed.
Yeah.
However, gold has its limitations in a modern society. You can't transport large amounts of gold. That's where
Right.
Bitcoin also has a benefit, being, a native digital currency. So if I wanted to, if you were in Costa Rica and I wanted to buy your house, and we agreed on a price, I could just send you the Bitcoin directly. There'd be no issues. It would happen, in 10 minutes, be confirmed on the blockchain, and that would be that. So it has this transportability, which is a huge benefit to a lot of third world countries that are paying extremely high remittance fees to send money back home, and also large monetary transfers internationally, which often go through banks with wires that are paying high fees and conversion rates to different currencies. So that's a couple of the benefits of Bitcoin compared to a US dollar.
Right. And we're seeing that more and more with people paying. I think it's allowing commerce in undeveloped countries where it's allowing them to send money without need of a bank, where they don't have banking, or where wire fees are so expensive. It's allowing them to have commerce internationally, even provide services internationally, and build their own sort of economy or business, where they normally have a very depressed economy, don't have access to banks, and where the fees to send money or be paid would be very high compared to what they're being actually earning. So it's really opened up, I think, that side of undeveloped countries joining, being able to join the world a little more in providing goods and services and commerce. So absolutely, yeah, there's a lot of benefits, and I think, as you pointed out, that inflation being one of the most poignant over the last 2 years. Now, boy, there's so many ways to go, so many directions to go on this. I think with so there's criticisms with our food system, right? And well, you've picked 2 topics where there's a lot of criticism of the impact of both Bitcoin and meat on the environment, and that's something you certainly tackle in the book, is the environmental concerns around Bitcoin mining and around the CO2 emissions of beef, and as well, from farming to just at this point to the existence of cows at all, has been challenged and vilified for people are being vilified for eating it. as people are being vilified for using Bitcoin. Now, do you want to tackle that? Is that that's something you tackle in the book, I think? Is that something we can simplify here? Is that really
Absolutely. So we kind of introduced Bitcoin, why it's a good alternative to the current monetary system. There's a lot of issues there that could be dove into deeper. The fact that you're really just losing the purchasing power of your dollar over time. Asset prices are really only going up a certain degree to inflation, and then the standard wage is not even following. So really, the middle class and below is getting crushed with inflation. It's been compared to as a tax on those who don't have their money and investments. So that's why Bitcoin is a great alternative. On the food system side of things, I think your audience would probably be very familiar with why there's so many issues with our food system. Why an animal-based diet, for example, is so important. So that's kind of what I discussed in the book at the beginning: chronic disease issues, and some of the issues there with the increasing rates being so astounding, seed oils, the demonization of saturated fat. But getting into the environmental piece, this is it's such a big argument now, and it's funny because they both share this criticism, and probably the biggest one, right? Like there's a lot of people who might say, oh yeah, beef is not good for you for whatever, it causes cancer, but I would even say that those are less common compared to just being it's bad for the environment. You're destroying the planet. And it's the same with Bitcoin. You kind of occasionally get it's hackable, or the other ones I write about, it's only used by criminals. It was a favorite one for politicians. But lately, it seems like, again, it's the environmental piece. Elizabeth Warren is like a profound critic of Bitcoin and energy consumption. So yeah, we can start with this. For the environmental piece on beef, I think your audience might have some background. There's some great resources that have been out there in books like Sacred Cow. So I definitely try to spin it a different way or find more information that I wasn't aware of. So for me, and this pertains to both beef and Bitcoin, is when you look at the total amount of emissions, or in Bitcoin's case, energy consumption, which are totally different things, by the way, we're comparing. But for CO2 emissions on the beef or red meat side of things, livestock, it's really not the major offender in terms of total CO2 emissions globally. So depending on what resource you look at, globally, I've seen 5 to 6% is attributed annually due to livestock emissions. And then the EPA breaks it down as the agriculture sector is 10% total, which is even less than the global number. So you'd imagine nationally here in the US, it's also probably 4 or 5%. So that's 4 or 5% of a number that is quite astounding. And the other sectors and industries, such as the energy, transportation, these are really the main consumers or emitters of carbon dioxide. So first, just to compare, just to set the scene, that's important to know. But from a global perspective, what I wrote about in the book is, I think it's roughly 3 billion tons of equivalent CO2 emissions that the livestock and manure is emitting annually. And remember, this is in the form of methane, which is not CO2, but we'll talk about that next. That 3 billion tons roughly is the amount that the electricity and heat sector increased from a span of 2005 to 2013. So in 8 years, this one sector increased the same amount of the entire emissions of livestock and manure today. So that's just to give you a perspective of like how this scales in terms of each industry. So that's right off the bat is, this really isn't the major offender here. And it's an offender that has been happening for thousands of years. So
Right.
another area that, you know, I write about in the book is this: if you take up all the industries that are emitting CO2, probably agriculture, livestock are the only ones that would have existed before 1800, let's say,
Right.
before the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, maybe it has increased because we switched, you know, from mostly having wild ruminant animals. So you know, if you do the comparison, there may have been 50 to 75 million bison, 10 million elk and moose, 30 million deer, 15 million antelope, and I write about these exact totals in the book. They're all emitting methane. Some studies show that these wild ruminants emit slightly less or than a traditional cow, and of course depends on, you know, the farming technique. Is it more regenerative, more, you know, pasture raised, or more industrial, of course. And then the industrial farms, the centralized, the CAFOs have more
Right.
issues with manure lagoons, sure. But either way, worst case, we're talking maybe a 2x increase in methane emissions from ruminant animals in the past, you know, 200, 300 years. That may sound like a lot in terms of, you know, absolute statistics, but every other industry is in, you know, an infinite increase because it was zero or pretty much nothing. So that's the one part that I like to, you know, set the scene is, we're not attacking the biggest offender, but it's one that people can conceptualize. Oh, this is something I do every day. I eat food. You know, I could maybe not eat meat. That's fine. But and then of course, at what cost nutritionally? You know, which you've probably talked about at length by doing that. So that's one of the, you know, the pieces to set the scene. The second is, it's really not a fair comparison. So you know, it's methane that, you know, cows naturally emit when they're ruminating and go through the enteric process of digestion, of turning grass and forage into nutrient dense meat, which is, you know, an absolutely fantastic, miraculous process that we have going on here.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
So methane is totally different fundamentally from carbon dioxide, and all the emissions by the EPA, global IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is measuring everything in equivalent carbon dioxide. So for methane, what they do is they have a scaling factor, and 1 kilogram of methane is equivalent to 1 kilogram of 1 kilogram of methane is equivalent to 28 to 36 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So depending on whether it's the EPA or IPCC. So as high as a 36x scaling factor. Now, why is that? They're two totally different gases. Methane is a short-lived, what's called a flow gas. So it only is in the atmosphere for 10 to 12 to 15 years, but it absorbs a lot more energy in that time frame. That's why they have this extreme scaling factor. But CO2, which is a stock gas, has a lifespan of like potentially up to 1,000 years.
Wow.
So, but less energy, you know, each year is absorbed. So it's totally different, but it can have this, you know, longer term impact. So because of that, they've scaled it accordingly, but that's very controversial and problematic because methane that's emitted today lasts about a decade on average. And although it has a much stronger energy absorption than CO2, it's still that shorter time frame is not reflected in the global warming potential, which is that scaling factor that I mentioned, which is like 28 to 36. So there's been some critics on that. There's, I believe, from the University of Cambridge, has done some research, and they've proposed like a totally different modeling system that takes into account the short-term life of methane. Because the way to think about it is, say you have a ranch, Zane, and you have 100 cattle on those ranch, or on your ranch, and you've had that for 10 years. You haven't added more cattle, haven't taken away. You're actually, the amount you're emitting after 10 years is there's no change. So it would be insanely irresponsible for the government to try and implement a carbon tax on you, which is a potential future for this the world, which is scary.
Green tax.
Yeah, exactly, because they don't understand the fundamentals of these gases, that if you don't increase the size of your herd, you're actually really not increasing any emissions whatsoever. And of course, if you have a regenerative farming operation, you're probably even doing good by the environment, but we can get more into that. So what these Cambridge researchers compared it to is a power station emits CO2 by burning fossil fuels, and that CO2 could be taxed. But when that power station, or whatever industry, it shuts down, that CO2 is no longer emitting, and it's no longer taxed by whatever green or carbon tax may be implemented. However, that CO2 is going to be in the atmosphere for potentially 500 to 1,000 years. If you have a herd that remains the same size, like I said, you're not really adding any emissions to the atmosphere, because it's a steady amount, but you'll still be taxed every year because you have a herd of cattle. So it's totally unfair. And the Cambridge researchers came up with a new model called a GWP, so global warming potential, with a star on it, and have these plots in the book that it actually is a more accurate modeling system, by taking into account these different gas characteristics. So this is an area I thought was really cool, because I haven't heard anyone talk that much about it. I've heard a little bit of the conversation, but yeah, this is another area that just shows how they're kind of unfairly comparing methane to CO2, which would make the total number, this 4 or 5%, even smaller. It might actually be even less than 1%, which then, again, at that point, you're really negligible in the grand scheme of things.
Well, and you have a cycle, an energy cycle that's been around since before we were, populating this country. I mean, it's like an energy, from the sun and water to the grass to the animal and back to the earth and the air, and it's a cycle that it is in its essence. And when it's a natural carbon cycle, so in its essence, it's regenerative.
Yes. So and that's totally right. And that's a good way to get into the regenerative farming piece, is like that.
Sorry.
Bless you. No worries.
Spring in Nashville. If you didn't have allergies when you come here, you will. Sorry about that.
No worries. But yeah, the regenerative farming piece is like, that's the natural carbon cycle, and the soil stores so much carbon when properly, when it's in proper health. But again, this book is definitely for regenerative farming. It's not beef no matter what. It's beef if done the right way. Still, from a nutritional perspective, it has advantages no matter how it's raised, of course. But monocrop agriculture, feedlot, animals is destroying the soil. So we need to work together. And that's a main theme of the book. I don't demonize vegans or vegetarians, because they're really better than someone who's going to eat McDonald's, 4 times a week. If they're doing it, the right way. There's obviously a spectrum of vegans, but I mean, a lot of vegans probably won't even touch like a Beyond Burger. There's processed, and then there's the holy grail raw vegans, right? But either way, they have like the idea that we should be doing something to improve the food system, how it's grown. So if we focus more on that piece of this monocrop agriculture needs to end, then we can really reap the benefits of the natural carbon cycle that you're talking about. And then having the fruits of the labor from a meat and plant perspective. And if whatever you want to choose from that, you can, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, there's a question though as well, which I think you addressed in the book. I know you addressed in the book, is if that regenerative agriculture is actually scalable on a level that we could use in this country. For instance, as U.S. being one of the largest countries in the world, or most populated, um, is it scalable for to feed the amount of people we have here?
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. Also a common concern. And the short answer is absolutely. It's just what would it take to get there is maybe a better question that I don't have the answer to, because I don't control all the farmland and these industrialized big four meat
Right.
packers really control everything. But yeah, there has been, to start, larger efforts done for regenerative farming in Brazil that I read about in the book, and they've had profound success just scaling it, to like a very large amount of acreage or hectarage. In the U.S., yeah, I break it down with like a simple calculation. There's 800 million acres roughly that the U.S. considers grazing lands, which is hilarious because this has been used to kind of criticize meat eaters. In a Bloomberg article, it says 800 million acres are used to graze cattle, which, if you realize, we have 94 million head of cattle in our herd, our national herd. So there's no way that each head of cattle is grazing 8 acres.
Right.
Obviously, that's way too much. And if you look at the rest of the ruminant and livestock numbers, there's obviously so much land. I mean, I drive from Salt Lake City to my house in Wyoming quite often, and there's so much land that is not being grazed. And that's probably where the bison would have been thriving by the hundreds of thousands per herd. So yeah, we have 800 million acres that's considered grazable lands, which is actually a lower number than say 60 years ago. In 1949 to 2007, it declined by over 200 million acres, and that's mostly because of urbanization and just land or population increases, building new houses, things like that, property development. But either way, if you kind of take like a pasture raised standard to all the animals that we have in the US, whether they're industrially farmed, if they're chickens, by the thousands in like a caged area, or they're regeneratively raised. If you take the pasture raised standards of that, 2 acres per head of cattle, whatever, the 50 chickens per acre, I forget all the numbers, but it comes out to a total of like 400 million acres needed to like raise all the animals we currently have by pasture raised standards. And this is conservative. I took like the upper end of the range on all these estimates. And this doesn't even include multi-species grazing, which is a totally amazing thing, running chickens after a herd of cattle to eat the larvae from the mud pies, which lowers the rate of infection the following months, because the chickens are eating the pests, and running goats and sheep while at the same time can prevent parasitic infections, because they don't cross that type of animal. So there's a lot of benefits to that multi-species grazing as well. That's not even considered. So right there, we're at 50% of our capacity. And that just, to me, it's a glaring answer that yes, we can scale regenerative agriculture. We just need to put in the effort and get rid of, there's 93 million acres and 88 million acres being used to farm corn and soybeans. So that's 170 million right there. If you add in wheat, 25% of all farmland is being used to farm 3 crops. And a lot of that's going to animal feed. Another negative comment on, eating meat, all this land's being wasted to farm soybeans and corn. That's a whole nuanced topic as well, because, pigs, also beef is mainly criticized when most of that's actually going to hogs and chickens. So beef, out of those 3, has the least amount of feed in its total diet. I think have a stat here. It says United Nations Food and Agriculture estimates that cows have only a 10% of their diet is grains. So mostly is forage. Even the industrial farmed, cows. That's
because they only are at that industrial site maybe
at the
last
end.
3 to 6 months of their life, right? And so
exactly.
they're in grass until that point. Whereas chickens and pigs are pretty much, that's all they eat. That's all
They can eat it their whole life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I know Diana Rogers has been on her pedestal about that, and it's fantastic. But even the hogs and the chickens, they're eating parts of these crops that are inedible as well. That's another piece of the.
It's what's left behind. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's still way too much land being used. So if you cut that in half, we have another, 80 million acres we could use for regenerative farming. And then you could still grow cover crops and things like that to have crops to harvest, but still have the remnants for your ruminants and your other livestock animals. So yeah, from those calculations and these statistics, to me, it's like glaringly obvious that regenerative agriculture can absolutely be scaled. And if it can be done here in the US, it can definitely be done elsewhere.
For sure. Yeah, because we export a lot of that grain and that we're growing. We're exporting it and underselling other countries because they can't grow it that cheap because we're subsidizing so much of it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the grazing land you're talking about isn't land that you could grow crops on either.
Exactly. Yes. That's the other part of the puzzle that people like to overlook is how, I mean, you could see some of the landscapes out here in Wyoming. I mean, these are pretty like rough terrains. They're not flat, they're pretty hilly or rocky or whatever. But yeah, I mean, there's a cattle grazing grass at a 30-degree angle on a slope. You're not going to be growing corn or anything.
No. So the goats, chickens, they don't care. I mean, it's like, yeah, it's not farmland. It's not land that you could grow crops on, as you said, and they can go through and make food from it. It's making it useful. Which land that normally you couldn't build a house on, you couldn't grow crops on, it'd be unused.
But the subsidies that you mentioned, that's the real hurdle that I see.
Yeah.
So, and then I write about that too. If you look at the numbers, it is absolutely mind-boggling. So I pulled it up here. Since 1995, U.S. government's handed out over 115 billion in just corn subsidies. And if you add in wheat and soybeans, which are both around $50 billion, that's like 1/2 of all subsidies for 3 crops. And there's been some research that have done some analysis. If we don't have these subsidies, the prices are going to skyrocket. And that's actually not the case. I think one of the papers I cited said soybeans would increase maybe 7 to 10% in price if we didn't have the subsidies. So yeah, I mean, this is just absurd manipulation, which gets into the whole theme of the book. It's like we have way too much government intervention with the food system, with the financial system. That's why we have all these issues. That's why we need to go to a more decentralized route. So it doesn't have to be fully, every man for themselves, but it needs to be, we need to move the needle back. We're too far, and it's resulted in this unfortunate situation where people are having their health.
Right. We have really cheap processed food, which is very unhealthy, and then a more expensive and demonized healthy source of food or whole food.
Yep.
And that discrepancy drives more people towards the unhealthy processed foods, drives the sickness and disease. And we can get into that if you like. I know a lot of my audience has heard me rant about it. And, I think, you talk about the fat epidemic, diabetes, heart disease, all these things that have come on into our culture over the last 100 years, 110 years since the development of the grain oil, the soybean, the cottonseed, safflower, sunflower oils, corn oils, canola oils, all these oils coming into our food system, and they directly correlate with the disease that's come to our system far more so than any other single change. Really. I mean, I'm sure that's, so, and then now we have these studies that show, disease from like intervention studies, dietary studies with animals, and then some with humans showing associations, but intervention studies with animals showing the development of disease when their diet is made up primarily of these linoleic acid, based or omega-6 based oils, right? That contain a lot of the linoleic acid and the seed oils like you're talking about. So, which are just a way of make cheaper, shelf-stable food, as opposed to farm food that we used to grow up, we were eating in the 1800s. So, and
yeah, we have an industrial farming model that was made that started to just feed the world, right? Because in the 40s, World War II, there was this whole concern, population boom, the war. Wartime is when food matters most, and calories matter, the rest doesn't, because no one cares if you're going to have a heart attack in 50 years, if you're going to get shot tomorrow, or your troops are going to starve. And there's a argument about that, that you'd rather have a chronic disease than starve to death, of course. But we don't need to do that anymore. We have way too much food. We waste way too much food, and we just haven't changed it. Like, these subsidies have just stayed, and now we're just the corporations are so deeply ingrained in our politics and can get into how all this is still happening with lobbying, media influence, advertising, which I write about at the end of the book. That is, it's just absurd manipulation, and it's a great business model. I mean, yeah, I understand how profit margins work. I do that all day long. And yeah, it's way cheaper. If you go to the store, it's cheaper for the consumer too. People are just going to buy what's affordable, because their money is going down in value.
Right.
So it's all connected, really.
Right.
But yeah, maybe I could get into the environmental piece for Bitcoin. I know we talked about that, and then
please do.
Some of the
that gets confusing for a lot of people. Like, is this electrical costs and environmental, but how is that affecting the environment? I see electrical costs, but why is that affecting? That would be kind of, I think, the primary question.
Yeah, so it's definitely, I mean, overall, I feel like why people misconstrue Bitcoin is because it's pretty complicated stuff. It's definitely not like, if you're not familiar with electrical generation, with monetary policy or fundamentals, you're not really going to understand how mining works, how the importance of scarcity is. And if you just put up a headline saying the Bitcoin network consumes the same amount of energy as like France, or it's not France, but I think there was like Sweden, they always use some like Scandinavian country, I think, maybe to make people feel even worse. People are gonna, oh my God, that's so much energy. Like, what, we need to like do something about this. This is horrible. But when you look at the actual data, I mean, Sweden is like nothing compared to, the US. So I put in the book, I put in like the country comparison. I also put in like a state comparison. I think it's like the same as like Pennsylvania, or maybe it's gotten up to Washington now. Does that make you less upset or more upset? I would say maybe like, oh, it's just one state, we got 50 states, so maybe it's a little less. But then you look at the total numbers. So the Bitcoin Mining Council, which is an organization of a lot of the miners in North America, they put out some great data. So I'm going to be referencing this for the next couple minutes, but this is from first quarter 2022, and the energy consumed by Bitcoin mining is 247 terawatt hours. The whole world is generating 155,000. So it's an extremely small amount. I mean, like 0.16%. Even we want to talk about the CO2 emissions, all that, like 4 or 5%. This is way less. I mean, way less. So, and this is energy consumption, which is totally different from CO2 emissions. But energy consumption and generation is a large, is the main generator of CO2 emissions, right? Like burning fossil fuels, burning coal, a lot of that stuff. But harping on Bitcoin, which is actually the most sustainable industry. So per this report, 63%, or roughly 60% of the mining is done via sustainable electricity, renewables, carbon neutral.
Wow.
It's really like that level. I mean, that's first page.
That's unheard of.
What you need to understand, it's extremely high amount of renewable / sustainable energy mix. And why is that? Because the miners need to have the cheapest source of energy in order to be profitable, right? So like,
right.
If you don't understand Bitcoin mining, it's not like you just, it used to be you could just plug up, some hardware, maybe your computer, Xbox into the wall and mine some crypto. Yeah, in 2012, maybe that worked, but because so many more people are doing it, and the difficulty of the mining is much higher now, that you need a serious piece of electrical hardware. The Bitmain amp miners run like $10,000, $12,000 retail. They're always sold out. So good luck getting one for that price, or just getting your hands on them in general with semiconductor shortages. But that's expensive. If you want to be profitable, you really need either free electricity or like less than 5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is unheard of residentially, commercially even. So all these miners flock to renewable sources, or they flock to a whole other area that the world is unaware about, and that's free or negatively priced energy, because the grid is not perfect and it's wasting a lot of energy. So our grid is very fragile, and there's limitations to what you can transport, but there, especially in areas that have renewable energy seasonally, there's a lot of variations in how much energy is produced. So one of the best examples is 10% of the network used to be mined out of a region in China before China kind of kicked out all the Bitcoin miners. So this region during the wet season, which was like 3-4 months, had so much hydroelectric power, and it's in a more rural area of China, the Sichuan region, I think it's called. They would have so much energy from their electricity that there was so much wasted because they couldn't transport it to the larger cities, hours and hours away, Beijing, Shanghai. So a lot of it would be otherwise wasted. But the Bitcoin miners, they all figured this out, and they went there and they're mining Bitcoin for like nothing energy wise, but they're using it. It's not being wasted. So it's really, Bitcoin mining can be argued to be the most sustainable consumer of energy to ever exist. And not only that, they're just so they're so flexible and able to pivot on a moment's notice. So if you have a really hot day in Texas, and Texas is known for its grid instability, right? They are going to tell you, don't turn your AC up past below 74 degrees or something like that, and that's because they're having a demand surge when supply is kind of not catching up enough. And that in that instance, they're going to jack up energy prices too, because that's just how it works. So energy prices are almost like a trading desk of on a daily basis, depending on the supply and demand. On a super windy day in West Texas, prices often go negative, and Bitcoin miners right there, they can scoop up negative priced or free energy. They're such a flexible customer. So they're really filling in all the gaps in the energy production. And then when there's a surge, like a super hot day that they don't have this excess production, they're gonna turn off or scale down their operation, because they're not gonna pay that much money to mine Bitcoin because it's not profitable. So then they're actually curtailing their demand in a time where everyone else is
Right.
increasing. So they're actually helping alleviate pressure from the grid. So they're really, it's such an incredible relationship, and they have this flexibility to mine Bitcoin from energy that could be otherwise wasted. And some other examples of, you know, the hydro, natural gas flaring is a popular one. Colorado, North Dakota, Wyoming, you know, they flare off energy in the production of natural gas that would otherwise be wasted. Companies are now innovating to capture this now because they can do it to mine Bitcoin locally. You can slap a data center right at the, you know, the production site. You don't need to transport it hundreds of miles to whatever city that, you know, where your end consumers of electricity and energy are. You can have the mining right there. The cool one, El Salvador has been a million times, is geothermal energy from a volcano. You can mine Bitcoin at the base of a geothermal plant, which in a country that has no infrastructure they can't transport that, you know, to the capital city or the populated areas from, you know, the jungle,
Right.
these very isolated areas. So you can mine that Bitcoin and then send it via, all you need is an internet connection to just send it wherever. So in terms of being bad for the environment, the overall energy consumption is very low. And you have to ask yourself as well, how much should a monetary system be consuming? How much energy is our current monetary system consuming? All this, you know, physical bank locations, I mean, sending transactions, that all consumes energy.
For sure.
There's
For
some
sure.
things that consume energy that are absolutely pointless, like Christmas lights is always a fun one for the Bitcoiners to bring up, and is also in this report. And some holiday lights consumes more energy than like a small country, like
Right.
in El Salvador, which is hilarious. But no
Right.
one's ever saying to turn off your Christmas lights,
Of
of course. So there's
Well, it
a lot
doesn't
of
threaten anything,
nuance.
does it?
Yeah,
Don't threaten a power struggle over your spending.
So there's a lot of nuance, but overall, if you just look at the sustainability mix, the innovation, and then the overall energy consumption is really a drop in the bucket. I mean, we're talking about probably the most important consumer of energy going forward in our society. And it's really inspiring innovation that we would have never had if Bitcoin wasn't around, which is, I mean, it's so fascinating.
It really is. It really is. Yeah. And in terms of economic systems, when a lot of people consider, say, the Austrian approach to an economic system, and Bitcoin checks all those boxes as far as scarcity and not having a government that can increase supply, and you know, you have something that is truly, as you know, as we say, decentralized, meaning there is no centralized control over it. The people that created it are anonymous, they're gone, nothing can be changed, it can't be manipulated, it can only be used. And it'll only be created for a limited period of time, and then it's just purely used in exchange as a method of exchange. So my understanding is everything's compared to gold as far as hardness, which is the combination of scarcity, usefulness, right? And I think in the next halving, isn't Bitcoin supposed to pass gold in terms of the definition of hard as being a hard currency in its value? Like it's actually going to be a harder currency than gold. And I think some of that has to do with like the ability to exchange it, the ability to transport. But in its scarcity alone, it continues to be more, it will continue to be less or more and more scarce, even compared to gold. It'll be more scarce than gold in its, not in its ultimate. Obviously, we know 75 years from now, it will be obviously more scarce than gold because we'll stop producing it. But it's even in its halving, as you said, the progression of the halvings, it becomes over time more and more scarce, and is outpacing gold in that sort of definition. Is that something that I don't know if I butchered that
No, no,
definition or not.
no. You're absolutely right. So yeah,
Okay.
the next halving, then the annual, I guess you could call it an inflation rate or additional the add on to the circulation rate, growth rate will be lower than gold. Yeah. So from a
Mm,
scarcity perspective, absolutely, and then it'll only continue to go down, as yeah, we have like 2 million Bitcoin left to add to the circulation, which is getting cut in half every 4-ish years. So yeah,
mhm.
and then you have all the other advantages that we already talked about. So
Right.
it's yeah, but we're still, although most of the Bitcoin is, you know, out in circulation, you could imagine in 20 years what 5 additional halvings might do to the price. But you know, at
Yeah.
that point, many folks, anything could happen, but the value of one Bitcoin will always equal one Bitcoin, which is probably the most important um, thing
That
to.
is, yeah, you can't argue with that. That you can't say the same for the dollar. Um, and then if we want to, I mean, I think we really have um, shown the value of Bitcoin, the benefit of Bitcoin, and the fact that it is not detrimental to anything really. It's only gives freedom to people who are not and empowers people who are losing the value of the money they're working for. But as far as beef goes, which of course has been vilified not only for the environmental side of it, but from a nutritional source, there really is not a more nutritional source of micronutrients, a more dense source of micronutrients than ruminant meat, whether it's a cow, a sheep, a deer, a moose, a giraffe, goat, whatever it is. Those are all ruminants. They can take grass, as you mentioned early on, and turn it into the most nutrient dense food that we have on the planet compared to any. Take your top 5 vegetables. They don't compare to a beef liver. They don't compare to a ruminant liver. And I mean, kale doesn't even compare nutrient wise to ground beef. If you really line them up ounce per ounce, and then not to mention the macronutrients. The macronutrients are off the charts as far as protein and fats and so forth, energy. But to compare the micronutrients, and yet we have the most vilified food on the planet is actually the most micronutrient dense. Is that, I mean, how did we get to be so ignorant?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and yeah, you bring up all the great points, right, Zane? So another one being the bioavailability. I mean,
Yeah.
but even the front page of the nutrition, if you read all of them,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's incomparable. So I don't know how you can even debate this, especially when we know there's so many important vitamins and minerals and nutrients that are only found in animal foods like B12, fat soluble vitamins, ADK,
Yeah.
2, K2, for example. So yeah, but
Choline.
how did we come here?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, for a while, like I said, I think it started with the need to feed the world, right?
Mm.
So we started with these subsidies, and that kind of set the framework for this industrial farming system, because everyone was so worried that the population was going to be 10 billion by the end of the decade and we're not going to have enough food. Everyone's going to starve. So it's all about efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. And we're really good at that here in the US of A. That's for sure. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that was the goal, and we hit that goal. But then we still are having a food system or a farming system that's set up like that, although we don't need it. And we don't have the.
Sorry.
No worries.
Uh,
We don't have
it's
this
freaking
large.
Nashville.
We don't have this large population, or this crazy population to feed. We have plenty of food, and then yeah, I mean the whole saturated fat vilification thing started when um, Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack, and then these flawed studies came out, the 7-country studies from Ansel Keys,
Mm.
cherry picking
Right.
data vilifying saturated fat.
Right.
And then the sugar industry hopping on boards, kicking saturated fat while it was down with some more flawed research that's been proven. I read about that in the book. And then,
Right. Okay.
these big, industrial food companies, they saw this grandiose opportunity, and with modern day manufacturing, extracting seed oils is way cheaper. So they kind of just hopped on the bandwagon and started funding and pushing this all day long, and resulting thing is a food pyramid and heart
Right.
healthy labels on canola oil and polyunsaturated fats, vegetable oil, margarine, all the above. This is a perfect storm. And then beef kind of just got thrown into that because animal fats are obviously high in saturated fat. But even still, people were kind of still eating a good amount of meat. They're just replacing their cooking oils and other fats. But that slowly started to increase. And then with the whole climate importance, turn of the century, then it just really has gained momentum in that space. So yeah, it's been a culmination of trends, but yeah, overall the beef herd is down 30 million. So like a 25% smaller cattle herd. Consumption of beef is far lower.
Yeah.
So how can that be the reason for climate change increasing in terms of CO2 emissions, and how can that be the reason for increased heart disease and
Right.
cardiovascular disease? It's not. We know that.
Yeah.
Don't need to get into the whole LDL discussion, but I
No.
think everyone is familiar with that. Red herring, but yeah, it's really then what I talk about in the book a lot is the lobbying efforts, the advertising of these both large food companies, large agriculture companies. It's just the centralization at the top. They really control everything. The big four meat packers control 80% of the beef in the country, and most worldwide. It's a very similar number. JBS, Cargill, Tyson for poultry, of course. I mean, they're
General
so
Mills. Yeah.
influential
Yeah.
that they're able to pull this all off, and then they lobby extremely hard with whatever election cycle we're in to kind of just be in the know and sway the laws their way, keep the subsidies flowing, and that's how this is all happening. And then same thing on the financial side of things. Commercial banks contribute so much money to politicians, and this is both right, left, center. I
Right.
mean, my
Correct.
book is politically neutral because they're all in bed with these large corporations. Everyone has their own topic for which they're more for, but at the end of the day, it's all very corrupt, and it comes down to their influence, and then the media. So they spend so much on advertising. The top 50 companies that are paying for advertising in the top 25 are the large commercial banks. Big food has 5 in the top 50.
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical companies have like 10 in the top 70. Pfizer, J&J, GlaxoSmithKline are all in the top 40. They're spending billions on advertising. I mean, I don't watch TV anymore, but I remember growing up, it's commercials all day long for,
Yeah.
some drug, some medicine, or Pepsi and Nestle.
Right.
And that's so much money, and that they're constantly brainwashing. But what people don't understand is that's not even where they get you. It's where the media, so the CNNs, the Fox News, the CBS, I mean, these are your source of news, but they're being paid by advertisements. And
Sure.
you're not going to talk shit about someone who's paying your bills. That's just, I mean, it doesn't work like that, right?
Right.
Because that would be kind of foolish. So that's the relationship. So all the news, right, left, have biases depending on who their sponsors, who their advertising companies are. And that's why every message you receive is so misconstrued and biased.
Biased. Yeah. Biased. Exactly. Dead on. it's got a financial lever on it. So, you know, it's got,
It does. Yeah.
well, wow, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there to
Yeah.
consider, but you see how they do converge in terms of control, you know, monetary control, and you know, if you control food system, the financial system, what else do you need, you know, to control a population? And I think what we're seeing here is a desire for freedom in both. And I think you addressed that. So that's great. You have a book that helps people kind of ramp, you know, get like an on-ramp onto those subjects, so they feel a little more educated and like they can speak to it, think about it, make their own decisions with data that actually that adds up. You know, so that's awesome, Tristan. I know we're connected on Instagram. You're at Tristan_health on Instagram, as well as the book has its own at Bitcoin and Beef. One more look at it if I get it in camera here without my, there we go, in front of my black shirt. Where can people get your book?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. Definitely great conversation, Zane. Thanks for having me on. But
Absolutely.
yeah, the Instagrams are right. Also on Twitter at Bitcoin and _beef as well. Trying to build that up. But yeah, we're live on Amazon. That's the sole distributor of the book right now. So check it out. If you do buy a copy, leave a review. It'd be really helpful for the Amazon algorithm and how that works, and definitely share and spread the message. Like you said, I think this book is a perfect on-ramp for understanding what the issues are and how these messages have been misconstrued by the media and the general public. And there's over 300 sources of real data to back this up. I'm not an expert in Bitcoin. I'm not an expert in beef nutrition or farming by trade, but it's not that deep to understand where the gaps are, and really it's all about taking that control back in your life. If you want to have optimal health and be in a positive financial situation, I think it's a great tool for you to understand how to get there.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great. That's what more people need. They just need something they don't have to do the deep dive to understand the importance of it or the value or where they're being misinformed. There's a lot, like as you pulled right on the surface. It's just, and they put it all in one place. So it's a great resource for people who just want to like hear the other side of it and see some data to reinforce probably what they already suspect. You know, I think we have leanings. We're like, you know what, I don't think I get the full story, but I'm not sure how to you know, confirm that. And so it's great that you pulled that data in there, and from an, you know, with an engineering background, you know how to read it. Whereas a lot of people, you know how to read what something's saying. You're able to bring it together in one place. So thanks again for coming on and for sharing your research with us. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you again at another one of Paul's gatherings. I think it's fun to connect with everybody who's kind of like-minded, like about these same things we've been discussing, to get around a crowd of people where it's like you no longer have to try to explain your standpoint or kind of wonder. It's like we're all we kind of start off on the same level of understanding and agreement on things that are important to us, and then we can kind of grow from it, encourage and learn and level up and connect. So the relationships I got from that gathering and that I got from the last one and continue to be reinforced. I think we've got a great community that's trying to just find truth. You know what I mean? And I think that's what it's about. It's not about a love for steak, or it's not about just, I want to be a tech. It's like, no, we're looking for truth. And we're looking for something that's going to make our lives better and healthier and kind of cut out the lies we know we're being sold. And I think what a great community to be a part of. So guys, reach out, connect with Tristan. He's very much a part of that community, and he's obviously looking for truth and happy to share it. So man, have a great week. I'm going to put links to your social media in the show notes, as well as a link to the book on Amazon, so people just click and go right to it. But yeah, definitely reviews, guys. They really help more people see the book on Amazon. It's a big deal as an author to have just a few positive things being said about your book. It makes a big difference.
Absolutely.
Tristan,
Yeah. Zane, thanks so much. It was a great way to sum it up. And yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.